everyone. Welcome to today's Modern Analyst webinar. My name is Ben Eady, and I'm the online media manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Requirement versus System Documentation. Today's featured speaker is Jiří Wallach from Polarion Software, and the webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to put your questions in advance in the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd like to say thank you to Polarion for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jiří to get us started.
Thank you a lot. Welcome also you for helping us to have a chance to speak with all of you on the topic of requirements versus system documentation. So I'm Vice President of Product Management. I've been actively involved in setting up and improving of existing application development processes around the world for Polarion Software. For those who do not know Polarion, Polarion is a leading innovator in web-based requirements management, quality assurance, and application lifecycle management solutions. It's based on one single unified artifact repository orchestrated by a powerful workflow engine, 100% web-based. It enables to streamline collaboration, transparency, release predictability, as well as regulatory standard compliance. And the agenda for today, we'll discuss how requirements or system development fits into modern agile application development. I would like to focus on several challenges and take them as practical examples why and how to handle system documentation. At the end, of course, we'll have plenty of time to cover questions you might have based on the content you will see. So the only constant in life is change. This quote is so popular that you find it attributed to many people. Who said it first is not so important. What's important is that they all agree with its meaning. Constant change is a reality of the business world, and its pace is accelerating. To stay competitive, organizations need to continuously adapt to a change, and even more to actively embrace a change. This is easier said than done because changes can be painful, and we human beings are designed to fight pain. The agile approach has been manifested by following agile principles back in 2001. There's no argumentation on them, especially if, as stated in manifesto, there is value in the items on the right, but they value the items on the left more. It has been also proven that the agile methods help us to deliver the products faster, cheaper, and better. By better, we don't necessarily need to speak about less bugs or issues, but just to provide products with better customer satisfaction. But most of the time, when I ask customers what do they consider by agile methodology, I get a definition of the product backlog, of a user story, of an iterative development, not about the agile principles themselves. If I ask you or the customers, how do you document or specify your products, they say, oh, we have our product backlog. So let us start from that so we can later conclude and possibly get a better answer to what is a documentation versus specification versus product backlog. So the product backlog is what will be delivered, commonly written in a user story format, ordered into the sequence in which it should be delivered based on the considerations like risks, business value, dependencies, they needed, etc. It's very critical to really understand that the primary essence of a product backlog is that it is the core artifact that drives the development. It moves the customers and developers from tracking tasks that just covers the requirements on input into real product increments. It gives to R&D the scope to focus on the user story. That's the little project that is properly documented, including why this little project, the user story, is in the development. This is what enables the continuous verification and validation. Every sprint, I mean, we have a potential package of all those increments, the user stories. And the true essence is it drives the development. It describes the increments. They are feasible to implement. It's the product owner who represents the customer voice, and it has to be trained to really convert all the needs into the list of those increments. Challenge number one, integrity. Integrity is the ability to maintain correctness and harmony among all related pieces of data. I'm on purpose not just speaking about quality, as again, this is often measured by number of issues being reported, as we need to include also other aspects, such as consistency, and not just functional consistency, but also the design consistency, the user interaction consistency. If you bring this topic into the real life context, our projects, your projects, especially but not only the software projects are getting more and more complex every year. We have many customers coming from so-called mechatronics industries producing both hardware and software together. They reported actually a lot, if not most of the innovation happens in the software development part of the system development. The software components becomes more and more strategic and complex. You can read here about 20 million lines of code just for multimedia systems. There is no way you can just ensure consistency through reviewing 20 million lines of code. Do the user stories help to make the system consistent? Do they help developers to understand the full picture of the product? Not really. Why? Because they describes the increments. A simple example, I mean, there might be a first story that the login button on the login screen needs to be blue to attract user attention. And after a while, you realize that the blue is not the right choice, and you might have another story that it should be red because this is what attracts the people attention even more. So you are to really understand the existing behavior of the system, you would need to check every single improvement separately to get a full understanding. So we need to add additional documentation, let's call them, let's say, specifications. And what is very important for those specification documents is that they are maintained when done, as they need to continue providing an up-to-date information to ensure the consistency and manage the complexity of large projects. There's nothing wrong about the user stories. As I said, I mean, they really help to describe the dynamics of the software development. They represent those little projects that should be small enough so the developers are focused on the small increment and you can ensure the continuous verification and validation. It is very tough to write the user stories. When you speak about the specification documents, the component specification, contrary, they have to be very easy to read and very easy to write. So if you would compare the user stories and specification documents one by one, specifications has to be easy to read and write. They have to be structured, so not a big documents. Every single information in a document has to be easily, uniquely identifiable. When you write those specifications, I mean, the text is very overlapping. I mean, with user stories, we really highly recommend to have them in a flat structure, so you just go one by one. I mean, it's very common that the specification, the content in the specification documents is very much overlapping. If you take any paragraph from the document, it might be very related to the actual context of this document. They are not ordered; they might be prioritized. And as said, they have to be easy to write. Let me step for a second to a completely different area. You might all be aware about the test first approach. So the testing procedure typically defines how to verify or validate a functionality. A common approach was, I mean, to write a test after the implementation. I mean, the test first is an approach where you first write a test that is failing, and then you write a code to make a test pass, and you iterate. So, I mean, if you push a definition of the tests up front, and actually, we can think about the same for requirements. I mean, in the past, I mean, in a time of waterfall projects, the requirements were gathered highly upfront, as the test cases were gathered afterwards. Currently, I mean, we ensure the continuous testing, and we can ensure in the same time the continuous specifications. So that's why, I mean, we call the specification items requirements. No matter if you gather them before the actual implementation or afterwards. So the concept is not to specify everything heavily upfront, but to ensure that you gather the specification documents with requirements to ensure the consistency, manage complexity, and what's very important, to ensure that all those component specification, product specification documents are up to date. How does it fit into the overall agile process? So the common process is that you have the product backlog, you get the user stories that are refined on the top of the backlog, you plan them into the iteration or to the sprint. And at the end of each sprint, you have the potentially shippable product and updated product backlog. The update process would just be very similar. It's just that the component specification and product documentation provides supportive documentation that is linked with the user stories. So it's an input for a sprint for the developers, but in the same time, it is considered as an important outcome of a sprint, of an iteration. So every release, you ensure that you have a potentially shippable product, updated product backlog, and updated product documentation. Challenge number 2, compliance. As I said, I mean, many of our customers, they are working in the regulated industries where they simply have to provide a project documentation, product specifications. They have to provide a documentation of intended use. Sometimes it's just a bureaucracy, but we also need to understand that the software is becoming more and more important for the actual products. I mean, the FDA is claiming that the software failures are responsible for 24% of all medical device recalls. That's a huge number. What is the typical objective that you need to prove or deliver if you want to, or if you need to fulfill the regulatory requirements? The common one is that you need to demonstrate that the software units fulfill the software specification, do not contain underside functionality. You are told to provide documented requirements of your system to ensure that all the verification results are provided and exported for the certification authorities. And all the changes have to be tracked and traceable. Before I'll deep dive into it, let me just step a while out of the specification concept and think about the term traceable. What does it mean, traceability? There's a lot of confusion about traceability. I like the following definition of the traceability. The traceability refers to the completeness of the information about every step in the supply chain. Its ability to chronologically relate uniquely identifiable entities in a way that is verifiable. So the traceability is not just about the linking. We don't need really to prove that there are hard test cases. We don't need just to show the requirements coverage, even though this is an important KPI in our modern application lifecycle projects. But we have to prove that the tests were actually executed and the results were linked to requirements. So that's, I mean, the traceability. It's not just a link between a test case and requirement, but the ability to prove that the requirements were tested. We actually have a hands-on experience with certifying an agile process for functional safety. Polarin ALM is a trusted tool for ISO 26262, and we have been working with TIFF Nord on the certification. And actually, we were the first purely agile-driven company who have passed this audit. And the lesson learned was that actually the TIFF was not actually forcing us to follow any kind of the waterfall process, and they were completely fine with our agile specification approach. So they were saying that they don't require all the specification documents to be written up front in the waterfall model, but they were extremely happy that we were ensuring the product documentation, the component specifications, to be updated every sprint as an outcome, and we pay a big attention to make sure that all these informations are up to date. They understand this as a very important part of the agile process, that really this improves even the overall expectations of the certification authorities for having the specification documents up to date. Why? Why this traceability? Why all of the common specification documents were so important for the compliance for functional safety? The reason number one is that they require an impact analysis to be performed. Even if you don't have to follow those, let's say, functional safety processes, I mean, it's a best practice to actually understand the impact of a change before it actually happens. So what if I want to change the product behavior? That's downstream impact analysis. What if I change this line of code? The upstream impact analysis. How do the specification documents with the user stories help me to answer those questions? So let me give you an example. So what if you need to change this feature that a password must contain at least 10 characters? If I trace the data together, and that's a big benefit of Polarin architecture, that we can take a specification document, and as it is as it contains the individual requirements as uniquely identifiable entities, we can also present it in this traceability browser. So I directly see that if I change this, following high-level requirement is being affected, which was implemented in this story. So I can register myself as a patron. Through following source code revision, where following method has been changed. So if I really, if it helps me to answer very precisely what is an impact down to each line of code when I modify a feature, that's a huge and great benefit of the overall traceability that starts with the requirements through the user stories down to the task and linked changed revisions. I wouldn't be able to answer the same question if I would have just user stories, because I wouldn't be able to find out which story is actually affected, because as I said, it describes the dynamics. They can override, one story can override the other. These are the supplemented system requirements that really helps me to link the actual changes with the existing product documentation. So the other way around, the upstream impact analysis. So what if I want to change following method? I can open the annotation view, and I see that these lines of code were affected or were modified in the revision 96. From here, I can directly, open the details of this revision, so I know why these lines have been changed. What were all the resources that have been actually modified in this revision? And I can easily dive deep into the data and see that actually what are the additional requirements, why the system is working as it is. So having data traceable from the high-level user story, business case, or system requirement down to the code help me to answer easily both questions: what if I change the product behavior, or what if I modify a line of code? Chapter number 4, reuse. We executed a survey with our customers where we actually collected information that more than 75% of the information is being reused from a project to a project. I mean, all the exceptions are more or less the customers who are focused on developing a single project only. What do we call by the information? I mean, first, we share code, we share requirements, we share verification procedures, we share system models, UML models, simply everything. Let me just focus on a very, very simple example of product line engineering, just in the software context. We can think about a mobile application game, Tetris for iOS, and then on the fact that it has to be also supported for Android. You have a project, it contains a code, no matter if you use Plurn or any other system to manage all those artifacts. And if you know that you would need later to actually adjust and release the software for other platforms, we definitely start dividing the code between the common code base and the platform-specific code. The same, of course, needs to happen for requirements and test cases. The user stories, on the other hand, do not need to be split between Tetris for iOS and the common code base, because the user stories, by the definition as we have seen before, actually drives a development process. If there is just one team working on the Tetris for iOS, the fact that there is something in common is not really important for to really describe the overall process of getting the application ready. So here we track all the activities that has to be developed to develop the final product. So once we start working on the Tetris for Android, we of course need to track the user stories, the work increments in the context of our Android development, and link the code or write a code specific for Android development and write a code, reuse the code from the common code base. The same that we just add additional platform-specific requirements and platform-specific verification procedures in the dedicated project, and we link all of them that are in common between the projects. So there is a very, very big difference in the way how we manage, again, the user stories and the component specification in the variant management projects. And whenever you have multiple versions of your products where you would like to share the commonalities. So you need to manage the requirements variants without copy and paste. So whenever there is a requirement that is shared, you want to prevent the situation that you simply copy the specification from one place to the other, and because of that, you simply include a reference to the common requirements. This helps you to propagate the changes instantly or on demand from the common system requirements into the actual variant specification documents. This saves a lot of time on managing the isolated copies of my variant specification documents. As a result, those component or product specification documents exist for both product variants or 10 product variants. It contains all the information that are up to date, and this really helps me to understand the context of my large complex project development. This is really very different of tracking the actual user stories. If we speak about the product variant backlogs, the user stories, they describe the actual increments, the changes that needs to be implemented for the specific product or variant projects. So it's very, very different, and understanding those differences with the proper support of the tools help you to ensure that the informations are properly reused without a copy and paste, easy to read, easy to write, and at the same time not lost in the huge product backlog that just describes the increments. Before I'll let you ask more, let's say, questions, or we can discuss it more verbally. Let me explain one important aspect of all of that. The question is, why do I speak about requirements and not the actual test cases? So why the specification has to happen in a textual form rather than just collecting the actual verification procedures? You remember on the very beginning, we were saying that the requirement specifications has to be easy to read and easy to write. That's because they actually describes what we have developed. It describes what is the system doing. On the other hand, the test cases describes more how the system has been implemented. So the verification procedures were designed to easily confirm that the system works as expected, but they are very difficult to read in a term, please explain easily what was actually implemented and why. So that's the reason why actually at the end we need to combine everything together in one single unified development where we manage the user stories that helps to drive the development. We manage the requirements that helps to understand the complexity and consistency of the product, and we ensure that we keep the quality, the integrity via verification scenarios. Let me go to the Q&A session. Why are you so promoting the textual requirements over the modeling, UML models and system models? It's very similar to actual test cases versus requirements. The UML models that they help to actually design how the system should be implemented very nicely in the future. But if we want to gather easily information, what was actually implemented, to document the intended use, to make sure that anytime we change anything, we will not break anything, the textual information is very easy to be indexed and searchable. And searching is very key ability in finding the relevant information. This helps you to drill down into the traceability tree easily and fast. So if you perform the impact analysis, you can instantly get to the point what has to be changed and when. You get the requirement specification from the user story, similar to the test verification scenarios. Yes, the component specification documents has to be updated while you are working on the user stories. There are two possible approaches to document all the additional details in the definition of done of a user story, and then make sure that at the end the system component specifications are updated. But that's a little bit of a waste of an effort. What we have a very good experience with is that in the time when the team is actually preparing the testing procedure, so following the test approach, or when the team is actively start working on the user story, they start gathering the actual or start writing the system requirements as they are start writing the verification procedures. So it's a continuous process. It's not, that you gather them from the user story, you gather them with the user story in the same way as you start working the verification procedures on the code or whatever. Document specification should keep all versions of user stories, all, even if they are changed. Actually, the component specification or product specification documents, first, they do not really contain the user stories. The user story, really consider the user story as a little project that is assigned to a development team. That's really a primary purpose why the concept of the user story was implemented, to keep the development team focused. There is a very big content redundancy. If you would open the overall backlog, you would see a lot of information being copied from one story to the other. So you don't actually need to keep all the user stories. In one of my slides, I've mentioned that once the user story is implemented, it can be more or less discarded. So that's why you actually get the information from the user story, the information that describes actually what has been implemented, and you move it out from the user story to the actual specification document. And if you split this content, what has to be maintained for the future and what was actually tracked to help R&D team to stay focused, this helps you to ensure that you keep only the information that has to stay extracted in the component specification documents, and the user story is there really just as an input for the development teams. You keep the last version of requirements or together with history of changes. So first, of course, because of the regulatory requirements, all the specification documents, all the user stories, everything is being versioned if we are considering using Polarium for application lifecycle management system. So in general, you have the access to every single modification of any requirement or the user story. If, a requirement or a component is being completely removed from a version, so let's have an example that you have released a version 1 of your software, and in version 2 you replace one component completely with the other one. Then we typically recommend to hide, the requirements that are not related to the most up-to-date version of the software from the head revision of the component specification documents. But as everything is really versioned and the requirements are just hidden from the document specification, you can still access them. So practically speaking, if I would need to perform the upstream impact analysis and I find out that some code is still in the system no matter that we have completely removed the component, I will be able to find out the actual requirement that was related to this line of code. And because I will see that it is related to the user story that actually describes why this component has been removed, I can freely decide that this, let's say, line of code might be modified freely because it's not yet exposed in the product anymore. So to to answer your question properly, it's really more, we need really to understand better. I mean, if we speak about the minor changes, or whether we speak about the major changes, and when and how the requirement can be actually modified. So the overall concept is that the information is being extracted from the user story into specification documents that are easy to read and easy to write, easy to search, and traceable. And that's the information that you have to maintain. Maintaining the user stories doesn't give you an easy way to actually find out how the system is actually working and what is being implemented. What exact tools to link specification and user stories can you advise? As you might have seen in the actual presentation, I've included several screenshots from our solution called Polarion ALM. That's a unified solution for application lifecycle management. We covered the requirements management, quality assurance, but also development processes. We include support for agile project management, for hybrid project management, for V model. So we don't really force you to follow any specific methodology, but we are keen on focusing on the traceability and on version control management. So if you would ask me for the recommendation, I would definitely recommend Polarion ALM to manage the overall process. On the other hand, we also have integrations with other popular tools. It's common that some of our customers are using Polarion for requirements management, for writing those component specification documents, and some other popular agile tools for the project management. Even though we really truly believe that a unified approach, one single technology, one web application enables much better collaboration, and it really streamlines all the communication of all your team members. How we can manage the change request and its impacts on requirement specification. There is not really a big difference between actually managing the change request or user stories or task. I mean, the thing is, if there is a change request, how do you find out what components are affected? If you just track the change requests and user stories, a user story is for R&D team. On the other hand, the change request is typically requested by the product management, by let's say sales or support organization. It's very hard to link them together to find out what is the possible impact from the reasons as I explained before. That's why I mean what is really important is to be able to very quickly and efficiently search for the information that is related to the feature or to the change request. If you find the possible feature, then again it's all about having the data traceable. I was showing you the traceability browser in Polarion, where if you properly link the requirements, user stories, task, code. We have the integration also with modeling system, with MATLAB Simulink, with Enterprise Architect, with IBM Rhapsody for UML solutions. If you link the items together, that helps you to actually follow the path just in your browser and find out the possibly affected components. That's the one way that you, of course, need to search and find the requirements that might have been modified. Once the requirement, of course, is modified, there is an industry standard approach of having all the traces being marked as suspected. So there is a suspect management capabilities implemented in Polarion. So when I change a requirement, I notify all the other colleagues that the verification procedures has to be updated. Technical documentation, online manuals have to be updated. So if the data are traceable and searchable, you have much better chance to to perform this traceability as demonstrated before. Will the slides be circulated? I think that the Modern Analyst will share the actual recording of the system, and I can also share the slides with you. I will make sure that you will get the actual copy. Use case shows time frame, how it's possible with requirement. There is a value in each of the software development artifact. There is a value of tracking verification procedures, user stories, even use cases. The nice on requirements is that we all know how to write them. It's just, we write what we expect or what we know the system is doing. And this information is easily searchable and traceable. I'm not saying that the use case elements are simply wrong. Yes, we do include support for use case modeling inside of our application lifecycle management system, but we have a very bad experience if we ask the agile teams to introduce or to enrich the user stories with use cases. They think that it's simply redundant. So they prefer to really have the user story describing, the little project with an explanation why it is actually why the team is focusing on the change, and to not waste a lot of effort and money. The process of extracting the information into the requirement specification documents has to be very, very simple. The easiness of use, the simplicity, the way that you can link the data just with 2 clicks is really essential for success. All of what I was showing today is based on the fact that you have to be able to link and provide those additional documents very easily. If you have a team of people who can convert all the textual information into the use cases, yes, it's also a way to go. They can be also indexed. It's just that very often, where it ends up is the situation that as the use case diagrams are much more costly to be maintained and updated, they are very often out of date. And having the specifications that are out of date is like having no specification documents. Who prepares user stories and specifications? That's a very good question, because the user stories, this helps R&D to stay focused, enables the continuous verification. You need to have really very special skills on breaking down the epic, the big feature, into the sequence of those increments. To find product owner that is able to translate, to articulate the need in a way of user stories is very, very difficult. Very often, it's so difficult that those people don't have enough time sometimes to prepare, the competitive reviews, to speak with the actual customers. So they have to have a supportive team that will actually provide them more information about what are the actual customers asking for implementation. And then the question is, we have a very good experience with product owners, technical product owners, really converting the initial set of requirements into the user stories, and again trace them, and later verify which of these requirements have been implemented, just because the conversion is a non-trivial activity. So if you would ask who, the question would be, the user stories are prepared by the product owners, not by developers, not by product managers. The product owner is really someone who can speak the language of a development team and can understand how to split the feature into the sequence of high-level activities. And the specification documents are actually updated by many different stakeholders. These are in the same way as we have cross-functional agile teams, people who are both testers and developers, so people writing tests and developing code. We have a practical experience of having the same people also actually actively updating the specification documents as it is the outcome of the development process. That's a very critical moment to understand that the R&D team owns the component specifications, so they are primarily responsible for having them up to date. The requirements are not an input that is gathered up front, but it's an outcome of a development process. Would you map the development work to an entire user story or to an individual requirement? The user stories has to be small. I mean, typically, we speak about 1 or 2 days of development. The nice on requirements is that they should be also pretty granular to enable, let's say, fine-grained test coverage. But I would definitely map the development work with the user story. So the user story is on input for a development team. The requirements, they document what is actually the system doing to help people implement the features consistently. We can consider them as a design guidelines. If we speak about the user interface, we probably all have specifications how the user interface has to be implemented. It's just because, you can reuse a lot of components, you can have the guideline implemented in the code. But very often, as we are managing different platforms, different variants, you also need to extract this knowledge into a written specification. And that's very similar with the actual development activities. What is, though, important is whether the individual requirements will be marked later by developers as implemented. And here, that's very likely considered as redundant process. So the only thing that really matters is that you have the specifications up to date and linked with the user stories. So you know in which stories were affecting the requirements. You mentioned discarding the user stories, but do they still end up in the final documentation? Any free tools that may help us in terms of traceability metrics and methods? If we, considering your question, we are probably not really coming from, let's say, a formal software application development of embedded software for medical devices or functional safety. Whenever, we speak about the documentation, the user stories are often not included. It's simply, they are so much overlapping that there is no value of including all the user stories in any kind of a documentation. They are kept in the system because there is still, let's say, a value in tracking all of them in the system. As I said, for example, you link the change of a code with a task. The task is linked with a user story, and the user story is linked with requirements. So they are linking the actual requirements with the code. So they stay in the system. But from the product documentation point of view, all the necessary information that is important for impact analysis or for getting understanding how the system is working is extracted into the users, into the requirements or into the verification procedures. So this is test cases. Any free tools that may help us in terms of traceability metrics and methods? That's, I mean, a topic I could probably hardly answer from my position. In general, I would say there is one important, let's say, requirement for those tools. Whenever we speak about the specification documents, you have to be sure that we don't speak just about the large Microsoft Office Word documents. We need to make sure that any information in this specification document is uniquely identifiable and traceable. So if there is an information that the password has to have 10 characters, you should be able to point to this information very easily. If you search, I'm sure that you might find some tools that that help you with traceability, but I would definitely consider also investment because it pays back pretty quickly. There is an option that agile projects only need user stories for documenting both requirements and system design, and no specifications are needed. Could you please share your opinion on this? I mean, I've probably already explained that. The biggest problem with user stories is that one story might completely override the previous one. I mean, that's the beauty of continuous verification and validation. When I share the product at the end of the sprint, and the product is really working because we are, let's say, focusing on developing the potential shippable product every sprint, every 2 weeks, I can get the immediate feedback from the customer that what they actually see is wrong. So I need to then plan a user story that potentially completely modifies the way how it is implemented. But in this user story, I will focus only on a change that I need to develop. So I'll describe in the format of the user story a change request. So saying that no specifications are needed, very likely all the informations are stored in the user story. But the question is how easy for me it is to get this information. If I would need to check, let's say, 50 to 100 user stories for a given epic to reconstruct what was actually developed from all those stories, even though many times, I mean, a decision has been replaced by a different solution, this doesn't really help me to perform the impact analysis fast. So that's the common approach. As we separate the verification procedure, the test cases from the user stories, because we want to automate them or because we want to outsource them to someone else, let's also extract the information, what has been implemented, how the system works, into the actual requirement specification documents that are part of the outcome of the sprint. It has to be really accepted by the development teams as their primary artifact. They have to understand that the code is not itself enough to keep the product consistently developed. They need to understand that searching the user stories is painful and you spend too much time to find the relevant information. And again, here we are. The solution has to be very well designed so it's easy for your team and it's fine-tuned to extract the information quickly and reliable. If it is not easy, if this is not up to date, all it is just waste of an effort. And that's where we were really concentrating on with our Polar ALM solution, on making sure that the traceability is really seamless and the extraction of the information is very, very powerful. What if the user story needs to be updated during a sprint? Should the user story be updated, or should the user story be closed and the user story created? So now we don't speak much about the requirements, but the question continue. Also, should the specification document be updated after user story is closed? Of course, and that's actually the point, that it's very common, I mean, that the user stories are specified not into every single detail. And that's actually, I mean, there's nothing wrong about it. The goal is that once the user story is closed, you have everything updated. If I would need, again, I mean, to, after the user story is implemented, after it is closed, and I would need to just modify the functionality, of course, I plan a new story. I describe why I'm doing it in the format of the user story. And at the end, I would have my requirements component specification updated. So if you speak about if we allow, or if I would recommend to allow changing of the story during a sprint, of course, yes, or not, of course. I mean, there are a lot of teams are refusing to accept to change of the user story during a sprint. Why is it so? The common reason why is it why they are so much against of changing the user story is if they are not really able to fulfill the sprint goals. Very often, if you would deep dive into the problem why they are not able to estimate the stories properly, you find out that it might be the technology, the frameworks they are working with that are not predictable. It might be the code that is some spaghetti code that when they implement something, it gets simply takes more time. But it's worth time to educate them that it's better if we change the story during a sprint than if we would need to change the implementation the week after. So there are really, I mean, two different questions, and I hope I answer both of them. We'll be sharing the presentation and the web session. Yeah. I think that's these are all the questions. Thank you for all of them. They were really good and focused on the content we were presenting. Thank you, Modern Analyst, for giving us the chance to have this this webinar. And I'm sure that we will share the recording with all your users. And I'll also share my PowerPoint slides with you so you can share it with your team members if you like.
Thank you, Jerzy, for a very informative presentation. Thank you for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. This concludes today's event, and we hope you have a great day.